So we have this elegant name in English, but we will be talking about very practical things because this is one of the tasks which have to be considered by modern politicians and which, however, have not been resolved. But what is important is the conflict between the political experience of the society, I'm talking about the Russian society, and the views in this society of its own politicians and of those who are supposed to be the leaders. The leaders and indeed the representatives of the nation. What we see today is a disparity, a void in this part of the Russian society, and this has affected the general story, and depending on how this void is filled, will dictate the course of development of political history of Russia in the very in the coming years. I derive from the fact that the political community in Russia does exist. That this community is numerous enough to have political results, but it does not see representatives that such a community would be ready to vote for. If we use the terminology of market economy, then this is a true conflict between objective demand and subjective supply. And the absence of political achievements, as well as the absence of and indeed a stagnation which does not allow to produce both the leaders and those who are going to follow the leaders. So, for us to go back to the contemporary situation, I would like to move on to move back to the 20th century for some time. And there are people here whose careers started in the 20th century, 30 years ago. Just in the beginning of the legal political movement in Russia, there was a general event field which brought about politicians of the second half of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, which was a general story. It was a story of a family, not just the story of the state, and there were events to which people were reacting in a specific way. First of all, we're talking about World War II. And I'm talking about World War II and not just the war on the territory of the Soviet Union, but starting from the very beginning of the war in 1939 through to the Japanese war in 1945. It is also a certain attitude towards Iosif Djugashvili, towards Gulag, towards the history of repressions, the history which affected millions of families. It is Article 6 of the Constitution of the Soviet Union. It's the political monopoly of the Communist Party and a hypothetical impossibility of multi-party. It's the aggression into Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. It's the world-renowned demonstration of the 5 persons in 1968. It is the Cold War and 1962 crisis, when the world was standing on the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and everybody literally watched into the mouth of the fresh hell. It is the leader of this movement, Andrei Sakharov, who was able to cross the line between dissident thought and politicians. It's the cultural codes of the names of Akhmatova, Pasternak, Galich, Tsvetaeva, and so on and so forth. When somebody could recite a poem and know who is in his or her company in that room. Well, I'm moving very quickly to the aggression into Afghanistan, and finally the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, because the Soviet management system entirely collapsed. But the society prevailed over the state, and the state was not even able to start its suppressive machine. So we're talking about a signal system which opened up the politics for people in Russia. There was a field for open discussions, and we foresaw, and certainly we saw this majority of the Russian society. Over half of the Russians voted. And this was indeed the major political force in my country, which became the majority in a matter of several years. So the Soviet Empire, which had existed for over 70 years, could not stand against these forces of the society. And indeed, one day in those years could be more significant than several years in different times. So this was a unified space of printed word, of cinema, and television. And I'm not talking about interpersonal communication, which of course has always existed and will exist, but when we talk about the general widespread field of public discourse, then we're talking about not just specific historical events, but also the media, the books, which by that time allowed the monopoly for political broadcast. This became the source of perestroika and the positive consolidation of the society in 1987, 1991. Boris Yeltsin was elected in June of 1991, and this consensus allowed to, not without violence, but without much blood, to overcome the crisis of August of 1991. The politicians, if the politicians had known what wealth they are seeing in front of themselves, they may have acted differently. Because indeed, the first question in front of them was not so much to build new institutions, but to preserve this society together, not to allow this community space to vaporize in the inevitable reforms. And it may well happen that in other circumstances we would have had a different story, a different constitution, and maybe a different president in 1996, even though not in 1991. According to all reminiscence of the political leaders in this era, apparently such a question was never formulated, neither openly or closely. And so in our view, in the eyes of those who lived through this time, this community collapsed. These communication bridges indeed went into nil, and what we received was a certain vector of political development, which led to the society we're seeing in Russia today. And indeed, we have not given any answers to this conundrum. So the question of the only tasks which were at that time posed were 100% practical. How to retain power, how to manage the property, how to gain control over the parliament and over the judiciary. And in each specific case, this task was attained in an effective way. But the system failed, and the democratic state was not eventually built. So this led to the shrinkage of the democratic society. And not just because of the poverty, because the poverty was inevitable at the time of economic reform, but primarily because of society involvement, direct civic participation was certainly disregarded. And we see a lot of material in this, and while history is alive and quite hot, it is difficult to analyze it in terms of objective study. And while the feelings are still boiling and the passions are still boiling, we can hardly analyze these cases. But then I think one day this history will be written, and we will see this as an exemplary case of how democratic reforms should not take place. Well, all of this in total led to the defeat of the democratic forces in the elections. And after the elections of 1995, starting from 1996, all the electoral campaigns were dishonest, unfair. But this also became possible because a significant part of the society, of the people, stopped coming to the elections. The people usually voting for the Democrats were, from that time on, in minority compared to those who were coming to the elections and voting for the people in charge, for the government in charge. What did happen during and at the 1991, after August of 1991? First, the Soviet Union collapsed, and it became clear that the Soviet Union cannot be reformed. There were radical reforms conducted, which unfortunately led to hyperinflation, dissolution of economic ties, and pauperization, which led to the political crisis of 1993, which Andrei Zakharov mentioned, and which included the shooting at the Russian parliament. And I agree with Andrei Zakharov insofar is that we saw 1993 as an absolute watershed. The parliamentary republic of the Russian Federation existed from the elections of 1990 through to the elections of 1994. After that, a new constitution was hastily adopted, in which Vladimir Putin was already living as an imago, or some sort of an imago. And Chechen wars ensued, which led Chechnya to the actual condition of Chechnya today, including the Northern Caucasus. And these are, of course, all consequences of 1994. The collateralized auctions were conducted. After that, we have seen the second presidential campaign of President Yeltsin, when the entire Russian society was violated in the elections of 1996. So the absence of political alternative was posited at the level of the state, as I said, in 1996. So such a method of public governance led to an economic crisis, and then the default in a matter of a year, the explosions of the residential buildings, the second war in Chechnya, the inevitable retirement of President Yeltsin, and the advent of Mr. Vladimir Putin. Then we may remember the Kursk loss, the loss of the submarine, and I think that it was understood that human life is not important, is that there are conditions when the state was not going to try and save the human lives. So Kursk was a test for Mr. Putin, and it showed us what we have. There followed Beslan and Nordost. The second conditions, the second elections of Mr. Putin, and people don't even remember what happened during the second elections of Mr. Putin. And the second electoral campaign was not even a campaign. It could have been just a registration of the actual victory of Mr. Putin. And then, of course, terrorism came back. And against the background of high oil prices and the so-called oil wealth, terrorist attacks continued unabated in the public transportation, in the airplanes, and so on. And at that time, there was a decision taken to actually have this interesting replacement of Mr. Putin for a matter of 4 years by the very humiliated, humble, and pathetic Mr. Medvedev, from which time the politics in Russia became quite parody-laced. And when everybody understood, then, during this change, that Putin has come forever. The protests ensued in the Bolotna Square, and this protest did not lead to any political changes except for the so-called filtered gubernatorial elections, and the political system has not changed at all. What we see after that is the global opposition with the outside world, and the empire, which was by this time in its imperial state, started to enter the actual conflict with any person. This led to the case of Magnitsky, the law on orphans, and which, together with other things, showed the pathetic humiliation of the society. The return of Mr. Putin to the Kremlin was hardly resented in political terms, and there was not much opposition politically, which was a paradoxical situation. And indeed, Mr. Putin did not go through any full-scale elections. His image, his resources, and everything arrives from the TV screen. He never went through any debate-laced elections.
After which everything disappeared, because in politics 12 years that ahead of him are an eternity. That's why we see hunt for and chasing foreign agents, and the very notion of foreign agents in the form of the courts that built the vertical to the point where you could just press the button, after which the courts in Russia were over and done with. After that, an obvious new Cold War, which starts officially with Putin's speech in Munich, and Crimea in 2014. Crimea, and further on, eastern Ukraine, Donbass. That was a challenge to all things, to the world order that was pre-established. That was a deliberate challenge. There was no improvisation, despite the fact that events sometimes would develop like avalanche. It was a logical, natural, technically and other administratively prepared activity that just put in place a new layout of power. This is a trend to rewrite Potsdam Treaty, because in point of fact, they have amended the principles of the international cooperation as they were set after the Second World War. We are now in standoff with all civilized countries of the world. At that, we have designated a very dangerous desire to come to the political and economic lines with China, which is very dangerous. Well, that was a historic background, which was built up by the movement which could be known as Nashism. Nashism is nashi, ours. Well, this is very much the same Nashism when the bogey of the political enemies was worn. The effigies were put on sticks on Lake Seriger, and the same director. Against this background, Boris Nemtsov was murdered, which came as a surprise, even for many people, a first top leadership, because it turned out that the system was built, and this system began to develop along its own lines. In new terror attacks, including in the international context, including in such countries like Sweden, where we are now. And during all this time, Russian voters, democratic voters, have been trying to understand who within this country, alongside this nightmare, and many people realize it's a nightmare, who represents their interests. And that interest in government, not just in public life, but in government, as people who were elected to embody. And it all ended in a failure of all political and democratic movement and party at parliamentary election of 1916. People didn't turn out. Those people who might, who could shape an audience of the winner, didn't do it. They stayed away. I will discuss it once again. The events I enumerated are in common political experience, but there's one radical difference from Soviet. That experience consolidated the civil society. It created this huge pad of possibilities that led to political change in 1991 and the years before it, because there was a chain of changes. But then the general political history of the 1990s and early 21st century never brought together, but inside disunited the society. Another phenomenon of our new history. These events split the people. People who call themselves Democrats have very different take to all these events. They did not become the reason for consolidation. And the only events did not lead to political consolidation. Everybody recalls these events, but I have a different take on this. And these events do not cement our communication. We can say that right now we are at a time of democratic feudal disintegration. We have seen complete atomization of each democratic movement. Everyone is democrat in his own right. I'm not saying that this is bad or good, it just happens. And a generation where political events of the 20th century are not part for us, they are like very emblematic. I personally spoke a lot. We have no idea what happened in 1956 in Hungary on the Red Square. We have no idea whatsoever how the war in Afghanistan took place, although it's very often recalled right now because of the current military actions in Afghanistan. So if the events of the 20th century that cemented the Russian democratic society some 30 years ago had stopped being the worldview of the and politically conscientious act, most of these people saw only one leader of the country, that is President Putin, and nobody else but him. But politically being of age, I mean, whatever happens in a person's life after he turns 14 or 16, when at least you can make a distinction between political colors. These people have not seen what is independent television and never took part in any free election in their life. They don't have either experience of a free Soviet Union or a free democratic Russia that was experienced by everybody who lived through the 1980s, 1990s. But the world has changed. The main communication medium for these people is internet, and the communication takes place through social media. And they're not hierarchical entities. They're horizontal. How do you just manage television? By pressing one button. And all TV channels are managed by one button beyond Kremlin. But in internet, everybody has his or her own. I surf where I want. It's impossible to build a vertical there. This is a case where technical project, technological process civilization serves as a counterweight to technological vertical. So these saving discoveries, they open opportunities for it down there. This community does not watch Putin's television. It doesn't know what it is. It has no need in just taking this poison. And this is a very important, well, these people live online in real time. They respond to events very fast. They need minutes to take decision, and they coordinate major action. It's a matter of hours. And all the political machine, both machine of government and opposition, loses before these people in the completeness of the worldview and the fast way they take actions. In point of fact, it's much less than TV space, but to a greater extent it has common signals. It is self-sufficient. I don't want to say it's homogeneous, but it's full of signs and irritants that most of the society takes as one. This is the same that happened with the democratic society in the late 1980s, early 1990s. It's a matter of hours and may reach peak of public attention in a matter of 24 hours. The response should be really immediate, almost momentary. But at that it should remain correct and right. If the political and state decisions, it took months to prepare them. It took them for weeks to rewrite, and it would take months to adopt. For a modern politician to respond and to voice his position, it's a matter of hours, or at best, at longest, days. There's this new technological cluster led to the fact that in a country that is free, we now have free people who are ready to build a state that is unlike what they see, and that is not there. And there are no politicians who represent their interests. Actually, as this generation came up, it's natural. It's like grass grows to asphalt. On the one hand, it's reason to be optimistic. Second, something through optimism. And second, it's reason to act. Okay, they have grown up, this new generation. Okay, what do you do next? What will be built against this? And politicians disregarded these people. Nobody noticed because all the traditional means to manipulate people no longer work. They're not effective. And it turns out that these people, and they work in different notions, categories, hear different messages, they speak different languages. So in 2016, going back to 2016, people from the first democratic wave, that is people of the 20th century, a year ago, in September 2016, they turned out at election because they heard these signals through a historic personal memory. And they said, and they didn't turn out. This is a new society that, and they stayed home. So in the large niche, there are no representatives whose personal experience coincides with the expectations of the people in the 21st century. The main conclusion is that society is ahead of politicians. A Russian society in an unfree country, given all the totalitarian restrictions, and there are no free political organizations in an obviously unnatural structure of the political world, the society is ahead of politicians, and most of the active politicians were shaped up in the 20th century and never sort of reached 21st century while lagging behind. They're not modern. They do not shape modern agenda. They respond to the questions of today. So if it means you have fell out of the communication. This is in real time in the system of perception and the system of decision making. And the very fact it created unique situations when a person can take personal political decisions as he has complete set of information like politicians, because access to most information resources is general. The representatives of the society would be politicians who can create out of the flow of events that take place online and lead in this, so it helps them be modern. In the 20th century, we took us half a century to accumulate these events, and that brought us to the political changes. Between the 20th and 21st centuries, these events had the same retrospective luggage. But nowadays, consolidation is taking place every minute. Everyone is watching The Last Word by Sokolovsky, as they called it. Millions viewed it. This is a consolidation point, and here may face 3.5 million for just trying to find Pokemons in, God forbid, church. And that didn't happen yesterday, it happened today. It is happening today, and everybody's watching it. And it's a very different political environment. Now, all politics are taking place right now, right here. So this new community, for it to be strong, not to split up, to achieve political goals, so it should be sustainable and politically successful, and should win at elections, they should have shared values based upon freedom and democracy. This is the big military secret. What is the unity of people who came up with a single democratic community in the second half of the 20th century on values? It was based on values. They were the marker that predetermined the attitude towards all events. That's why they got the majority. People realized against what as well as in favor of what they speak up for. So the dividing line between the centuries split this, or rather destroyed. Then the government first tell that these values don't matter at all, even the value of human life. And when for the government human life no longer carries the value, what's the point of the existence of the state then? It goes away. And only then democratic community helps impact not only democratic, may say global development in an epoch of obvious crisis of democratic institutions that affected our country, but not our country alone. But this is a topic for another conversation. So thank you very much. I'm ready to take your questions.